I'll briefly offer a few themes and connecting themes and questions that hopefully we can talk about and get everyone else involved as well. First of all, just to think about what is the legacy of Ansel Adams, since that's the beginning point for the first exhibit. To what extent does his approach and style continue to inspire and influence contemporary photographers? If it does, and I asked Bill this question right before the symposium began, which is to what extent photography students today look at Adams as a source of inspiration. And maybe I'll let him answer that one for himself later, but my sense is it's not so strong, but clearly the historical legacy is there. In terms of environmental politics, I think Ansel Adams' legacy is perhaps more alive and well. So you can still get mailings from conservation groups like the Wilderness Society saying if you join the group, we're going to give you a book celebrating the American Earth or something like that through membership. So there's a sense that Adams is still very much a viable living entity, and his photography sort of captures a certain idea of wilderness preservation and conservation. But clearly there are a lot of photographers who followed in his wake and noted the limits to the wilderness aesthetic. Robert Adams is perhaps the most famous and also one of the more articulate photographers. Just reading his essays, you get a sense of the thought and the ability to articulate what he's trying to do. Whether he always accomplishes what he sets out to do is more question. He often notes that the wilderness aesthetic excludes more than it reveals, that it's something that often distances us from our real everyday experiences with nature by elevating the wilderness into this pure, pristine realm as something other where humans are absent. And interestingly, I think Robert Adams and others who came along in the 70s, I think they actually anticipated a lot of shifts that have taken place recently in environmental history and environmental humanities more broadly. And there's this effort to rethink what the human place is in nature, partly by beginning with critique of the wilderness as this, holding it up as this entity that's outside of the human. Most famously, William Cronin, an environmental historian, wrote this essay called The Trouble with Wilderness, or Getting Back to the Law of Nature. And it's a piece I would highly recommend to people to read. But Cronin sought to historicize the wilderness ideal by suggesting that wilderness was a part of culture. It's not simply this pure realm, but it was something that people had been taught to see in a certain way. He looked at the influence of the romantic sensibility from the 19th century and the sublime aesthetic, but also for Americans, he said, for the closing of the frontier in the 1890s, in the sense that Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian in 1893, warned about, that this part of American identity was being lost without the wilderness. And Cronin says that for all of the value and importance of the wilderness, there's problems with it, looking at space without people, beginning with the fact that it often allows us to forget indigenous presence. Many of the landscapes that became national parks had been inhabited by native peoples, and they had to be forcibly removed in some cases for these parks to be set up. So that amnesia surrounding native presence is one problem, it says. In addition to looking at wilderness as this unique place where nature is, and it does in many ways remove us from the natural world, but also from a responsibility for stewardship and sustainability to that, which he suggested is very important for us. Another theme that seems to emerge in a lot of these talks that I wasn't expecting so much was the idea of time and our relationship to place and landscape in terms of different notions of temporality. It was something that I knew I was going to introduce, but I wasn't expecting to come up so many times in these different presentations. From your look at the human and the geological and the sense of history that's embedded in this former Air Force base, to Terry's notion of looking at a place and lingering and having a moment, even if it's a 3-minute moment instead of a 90-second moment. And so there's a sense of slowness that's both in terms of, I think, enduring legacies and consequences of environmental problems, which we see in toxic landscapes, but also a slowness in an aesthetic appreciation or connection to the natural world. And I think finally that maybe gives us a question that's broader than some of the more obviously politically motivated texts that we've seen in my presentation and others, which is the personal realm of experience, which I think comes through most clearly in Terry's, but also in your presentation, describing the autobiographical component to it, the sense of wonder that many environmentalists talked about in the writings from Rachel first and before her and subsequently, but a sense of wonder that's not just about national parks, a sense of wonder that can be found in suburban places that Robert Adams refers to as the half-wilderness, reconciling us to this idea of nature, where we are, where some experience of wonder is still possible, which maybe in weird ways circles back to Bill's opening remark about photography as a form of acceptance, that's part of the act that's going on, even if there's a critique, overt or more implicit in the work, with a sense of acceptance of that reality and what it means for our futures in terms of environmental concerns, as well as personal and aesthetic motivations that bring us into these places. So that's kind of a wide set of rambling themes and questions. I don't know how you want to proceed in terms of if you want to pose any questions in particular or bring in.
I would actually love to hear questions from the audience to see if there are specific questions that come up or that have been raised through these conversations and directed to anyone here.
Yes, in relation to freedom's from the wilderness is the law I was thinking about, and I'll presuppose this by saying I am also a child of the 80s and one who's grown up in these, permeated, kind of cynically resigned environment of such. And I have found with the kind of concept and aesthetics of pristine nature the same problem in that we have presumed a certain steady state until sort of modern industrial capitalist this system came along and we become the sort of monstrous offspring of nature. But my problem is that reconciling this with the actual history of the earth leaves me in a kind of state of paralysis almost about what to do, as much as I am incredibly concerned about the environmental degradation going on today and the scale of it. But when we examine the history of the earth, we have seen some great extinction events. We've seen in a certain sense the earth being incredibly resilient and not so much a fragile thing. The biosphere potentially is more fragile. But in a way, how do we motivate people to act in the name of protecting our environment while still understanding that we are always in a dynamic disequilibrium with our environment, and all species are, and that there is no such thing as a moment in which nature was the way it was and we came along and destroyed it. And in that sense, as an aspiring environmental historian, I have trouble reconciling what I feel is the environmental science and history of the earth with what we need to do to motivate people in environmentalism. And I suppose if someone has an idea of what to do about that, I'd love to hear it.
I'm sure there's someone there who has a very clear, easy answer. I don't think it's going to be me.
What's that?
My 11-year-old grandson was here and yesterday we watched Waterworlds, the video, and he got to a point where he said, well, we might as well just shoot ourselves. It's hopeless. And I was trying to a little bit to get it beyond that to, okay, what can you do? What can we do? And you touched on that a bit as you talked about the personal versus the governmental responsibility. So I guess I'm kind of looking for some answers like that too, to convey to a growing young person, it's not all lost. What are the best examples? What are the best practices? What can I show you that encourages you for the future?
Well, I won't offer any answer, but I will acknowledge that the questions that you're asking are exactly the questions that we're asking within conservation organizations. We're really trying to, I think you articulated it very well, that it's a conflict between the understanding that everything on the planet is in a state of change and in a state of motion, and that human beings are having some level of influence on all of that now. And that bumping against, forcing your some decisions about, so what do you value? What's important to you? You know, in that state of change. And it's been very troubling, I think, to pretty much all of the environmental organizations around the world. And so they're all re-examining their missions. They're trying to figure out what exactly is our purpose here, what exactly are we trying to accomplish. Some of the organizations have made a change from much less of what we might characterize as a traditional nature conservation-oriented focus toward one that's more of helping to progress the human enterprise. And so, as I said, there aren't really any answers there. And I think the key point is that even in places that we would think are having lighter influence from human activities, that there are things that are changing there constantly. So your point about no static state is something that I think has really started to permeate not only in the scientific community, but also then out in the broader conservation community and out in the broader public. And so trying to decide what is it about the nature of change? So it's more of not what are you trying to save in a static state, but what is it that you want to allow. How do you want to allow things to continue to change? And to what degree of influence from human activities?
I think your mention of time is really, is really important. And in that, I find in teaching, again, I talk about this thinking in geological time, and actually talk about how the industrialization is actually a blip in time, and to liken it to, like ecologists to a disturbance, and so in a way, when I make those ecological, kind of parallels, that's kind of sacrilege, but what I think it does is begs the question of what we do and how fast. And I find, in giving examples, which there are plenty of in specifically remediation decisions, technologies and decisions, that the impatience leads to actually more environmental damage. And I think there's even kind of emotional damage put there. So for instance, the legislation that, wants to have the degradation, the pollutants kind of go away, kind of invisibly, like under parking lots, and, sculpted to look like the native, landscape. I just, find that not only environmental damage, but that emotional and that cultural damage where it's kind of camouflaging, enforcing that moment in the landscape, just render it invisible. So what does that do? How does that influence our continuing consciousness of that landscape? And also the fact that, many scientists now are discovering that, that idea of resiliency that came up, that leaving some of these landscapes alone is actually a smarter way to go. And that's like, for a lot of engineers and for a lot of industrialists, that are still kind of feel guilt and denial. That's, just radical to them, and engineers, like I talked about that at a conference once at Surface Mining, and I almost got run out of town,
Well, one thing I would say too, just to sort of bring it back to the notion of what photography could do, which is sort of, using Ansel's pictures as a way of starting this. I think it's, when we look at that history of say, the conservation movement using photography, I think it's pretty hard for people to trust that anymore. Even though my point was, I think that landscape photographers are trying to be true, or speak about a truth, whatever, their own truth and their experience. I think, like photography has a hard time doing that now because we are so inundated with the damaged landscapes, the oil spills and the pictures like that. I think it's, like the picture that Brian showed of that seabird with the oil dripping off of it. When those pictures were first being shown, that was a shock. But now they're everywhere, and you can go to art galleries or, art might be a stretch of the term, or you can go to galleries and you can see exhibitions of, oil-soaked birds, and it's hard to have the same impact. So, I think the question you're asking is a good one, and to just connect it to this idea of the symposium is how does art or photography in this case influence environmental action? And it's a really difficult way to think about it. I would venture to say that something like what Terry's doing is probably going to be more powerful now because it isn't sort of hitting you over the head with look at all the crap that we've done to the earth, but it's more like take a moment and realize that it doesn't have to be, again, this is not to disparage Ansel at all, but we don't have to stand in front of Yosemite Valley to have a moment. It can simply be this sort of focus in front of our eyes. I think that's a really hard sell, to sort of change the world, but I think it's sort of what contemporary art, at least what contemporary photography has to try to do, is to sort of like just get behind the scene a little bit.
Bill, I wonder though whether it's time for not only artists, but it's use of the media that you were talking a lot about. That could find a middle ground, right, with sustainable development that you were talking about. It might be time we've had the pendulum swing, right, to the horror. And now perhaps there can be a use of images accompanied by text that would allow people to have a feeling of what are some of these best practices, how can we involve our children in ways that will move the world forward while recognizing that we can't go back to the pristine.
I just wanted to pick up on something Frank said in his talk and his comments, and it relates to what we were talking about though. The problem still is what people are supposed to do. We're still back at that moment of what people are supposed to do. So no matter what the images can do, and they can do many different kind of things depending on how artists make them and media people use them, what are people supposed to do? And your wonderful presentation about how all of these images motivated great interest in environmentalism, participation in environmentalist organizations, etc. But the solutions all for were always individualist, consumerist oriented, go buy different kind of light bulbs or don't litter, or not that these weren't helpful, but I'm just brought back to your point, even how Al Gore's multimedia event didn't actually give us any answers that were larger than that. And even to refer to what you were quoting William Cronin's essay, which is a really important essay, and still I think he comes down to this kind of appreciation of the nature that's around you that promotes a kind of suburban interaction with nature that's also part of the structuralist problem. If we all have to cultivate our own nature in our backyard, then that's also its own problem, because maybe that's not the best way for us to be living. We probably need to be living in density and then letting land be out there, right? I don't want to live that way. I've got a backyard, so I realize that. But again, I'm just brought back to this moment of what the images can inspire us to think about, and what actually then is the plan. And as you so nicely showed us, there was all kinds of inspiration, and yet there wasn't a whole lot of plan outside of individual actions within a kind of neoliberal economic model that doesn't want to talk about the structural problems. So that's the question I ask of all of you. It's another way, I think, sort of kind of getting at what you raised, Justin. That's the question, what to do, after all of this inspiration.
Well, when I signed Cronin's essay, this is a little bit off the question, I'm sort of dodging the question first.
No.
Because you mentioned Cronin before, because I didn't call it, but the Cronin's essay, a lot of students read it as he's against wilderness. He doesn't think we should save wilderness, right?
No, I wasn't saying.
No, but this big question of action is that sometimes someone will read that and he's saying it's cultural construction. And a lot of people, environmental historians and environmental activists, reacted very negatively to the piece because they thought it was ultimately giving ammunition to the enemy, because if you say everything's natural, then nothing matters, we can do whatever we want, it's still going to be natural. And then later in the semester, I showed them an editorial they wrote in the New York Times, which was right during the Anwar debate, one of the Anwar debates that researched in the New York Times. And they were surprised that he was, in favor of saving Anwar. They thought, well, why would he care about, and I was, maybe this was not a great reflection on their subtlety as readers, so appreciate that you could, sort of be in favor of a political movement, but still want to critique some of its underlying assumptions. But also what's interesting about that piece is that he made a larger argument about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, that it's not just, this pristine place far, far away, but it's really an interconnected space that is home to migrating species of birds, and he actually tries to bring it back to his own backyard to suggest that certain species that are going there might end up in places where the reader lives. So there's a sense of a global interconnection even in this supposedly far removed place. Maybe probably is. I'm trying to answer. I'm not going to answer the actual question because I don't have the answer to that. But part of the problem I think is a lack of even being able to envision some of the systemic structural manifestations of the environmental crisis, because so much focus is on the oil spills, Deepwater Horizon and others, and the kinds of images that Julie showed from Brzezinski and others. Chris Jordan, I'm not sure if someone people are familiar with, but he does these really stunning video images called Running the Numbers, which shows plastic bottles and then a statistic about the number of plastic bottles consumed in America in a certain period of time. He did one on it was very much a reference to Ansel Adams' Mount McKinley photograph called Denali Denial, which used logos from the GMC Denali SUV and turned that into a picture of Mount McKinley in Alaska, and made a comment about SUVs and gas mileage and ways in which wilderness is often promoted in advertising these kinds of vehicles. And more recently, he's done this project on Midway, on the plastic garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean. And I saw an interview with him where he's asked this question. So I'm going to quote him. And I found his answer inadequate too. So he ultimately says that we have to recognize all these structural and systemic causes of environmental crisis, but then it needs to come from inside. And we need to have some kind of inner sort of spiritual rebirth that makes us turn against all of these products. And I find that to be, an interesting sentiment, but ultimately not one that seems, very efficacious on a larger political front.
Still individualist.
There's a variation on that I think would be interesting, because that's something that I'm really interested in, is how we actually, both individually but also collectively, construct models of the world by which we operate. What we're seeing is this kind of shift. It's one that there was this vision of the world where the human activity and the natural world were seen as two separate realms. That in fact we could act in sort of the kind of that early bifurcation in a way in the 19th century that I was thinking about. The one where the natural world was pristine and the contaminated humans could learn by and could ennoble ourselves or better ourselves through the interaction with this pristine natural world, or the opposite, where we know best actually that we're going to do whatever we want to do in the natural world in a sense is something else. That model shift, you might say, that starts to see the interconnectivity, that starts to, that is revealed in changes, everything from changes in strategy to changes in the kind of work that's being produced, is interesting to me because in a sense, it's the artists who are anticipating the model shift. Both reflecting perhaps what's going on, but before it becomes broadly culturally understood, these kind of collective mindset shifts. It's through the photographers, it's through artists, and it's actually interesting to look now and look very closely at the way perhaps another model that deals with systemic issues is emerging. It's a different kind of practice of art, I think, that is emerging now, that is making visible these underlying systemic relationships, and in fact, I think moving from kind of crisis, the crisis model. Some of I'm not as familiar with trying to do that in photography, and I'm actually wondering if in some way the medium in its focusing on moments is really up to the task of revealing systems. That's actually an interesting question, and whether other art forms that someone like Natalie Jeremy-Janko, or others who are really working with behaviors and experience and rethinking the way we intersect in our daily lives with these large systems, with whether it's the corporate or the industrial processes or the political processes.
Like we're to see moving into doing like a documentary.
Yeah, so I wonder, the thing that fascinates me is that artists are often ahead of the curve in a way in terms of the larger cultural forces and pose maybe not solutions, but a different set of questions that are going to lead to different behaviors and different actions. And that's where some of the promises, a couple back here.
This was really very layered and very expansive, so thank you for this. What I'm wondering about, and this is very open-ended, is a question of class. And that we've kind of tangentially been talking about that, but it's an issue that is, of, I think, real importance to have sustainable impact. And so I'd like to just open up that as a question without any solution. I just want to give an anecdote because I liked your anecdote about walking. And when you showed the image of the 3 Mile poster, also what was it called, China Syndrome? My father was an atomic physicist, and when that happened, I said, you know, did that ever happen? And he said, Barbara, it happens all the time. So that, I leave you with that. But if we did that, it's just a question of class and how can these issues navigate through that very weighty.
Because it gets at that question of where the power to actually, and
exactly.
who's on the receiving end, who's on the margins.
Well, I think
of
of
these
environmental
systems.
racism in that.
Yeah, did you want to pick up on
I
that
have a
question?
comment that actually plays right into what you're saying. It's like Bill said earlier, as somebody who spent most of my adult life in the conservation world, in nature conservancy, working for our society and others, struggle with the question what will still motivate people to act. And communications, that is the pivotal question. I think photography has played 2 sides of the coin. It has inspired, it has also made people so inured to the problems that they're kind of blinded by, especially in our age of social media. But I just wanted to tell this anecdote. This past winter, I went to Washington to participate in the Rotunda.org rally in front of the White House on a very cold winter day about the tar sands and the Keystone XL. And the abstract image of climate change is always one that's so difficult to visualize for people. The polar bears have been used many times. But the power of the photograph that day was when these tribal women in northern Alberta, Canada, stood up and showed what was happening in their backyards to their families, the power of those images on these huge screens. Again, it was preaching a little bit to the converted, but it was powerful. I mean, it was like, what is this happening? I had never considered it. And they had tried, it was mostly the women who were the leaders in these communities, all the way down the connected tribes from Alberta down to Louisiana, Oklahoma and everything. And when they're showing what's happening up in the forest, it was just extremely difficult. And I still think the power of the photograph is there to motivate.
Yeah, I'd like to interject something here about playing off Bill's point that the artists, the photographers, often being sort of the first to interpret, the change. In the backdrop of all of this, we can talk about, and even unfortunately, as Fine said, sometimes it comes across as being judgmental to talk about the photography of Adams as compared to more contemporary approaches. In the backdrop here that I think is important to recognize is the world has fundamentally changed in its physical nature. In the 1930s, the 1940s, 1950s, most of the world was in a relatively lightly influenced condition. And that has changed very, very rapidly. The rate of land development that started in the 1950s and went through to the present day was like a bulldozer going across the global landscape, not just the American landscape. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that I think that people's perceptions and values and interpretations are influenced by that physical world, obviously. And so if you live in a world where most of it is in a natural condition, your natural response to it is going to be, you're going to be spending time in it, interacting with it, and expressing that, artistically in various ways. Now we live in a world where the vast majority of the human population does not come into contact with landscapes that are not strongly influenced by human activities. And so naturally, our interpretations have changed of that.
I was really struck by one of the things that you wrote in your introduction, I guess, Bill, where you said the creation of a photograph is an act of optimism. So, a lot of these questions deal with, the sort of, woe is us, and how can we stimulate political action that require many flows of capital and political will to be employed. And one thing that really hit me about that, so I just want to say that I really love that idea, and you had concluded that by saying, so photographs can make you ask, what's next? So in a way, to answer the original question of the discussion, in a way, living is an act of optimism now, would be what I would say to all these questions. But I was really struck by a parallel exhibit. There were some engravings by Albert Dürer, from the 1400s, I believe, hanging adjacent to some of the first hanging of this exhibit. It was so striking because in that engraving, and now we're talking 600 years ago, right? Not 40 years ago, 600 years ago. What was he trying to capture in that engraving? Was the same human striving or desire, I think, for transcendence, I will say, through images, and there it was greatly compressed. What I think we saw in a range of images here, from the casino to Ansel Adams, what was shown there was the castle keep and the immediate trampled mud and destruction of a fiefdom, I guess. And then just outside, pristine images of leaves, like your leaves around the pond, and a horse representing idealized natural beauty. So I think, that was, that's why I find this interdisciplinary presentation quite inspiring, because I think if a photograph can continue 600 years after Dürer's engravings to stimulate people to ask what's next, then at least there's hope that humans will find some way to exhibit resilience.
Right. Well, that goes to her comment about her grandson. Seeing that, and saying like we might as well just shoot ourselves. The optimism that would be required to actually make anything.
Right. So I found that single approach extremely powerful, because I think that can be very lasting. It's lasted 600 years. Maybe it can last another 600.
Another powerful aspect of it, juxtaposing images of Ansel Adams, a great Yosemite landscape, and the destroyed, devastated landscape, is the temporality not mentioned but expressed in the fact that Ansel captured a landscape that was formed during geological time, yet these beautiful images of the landscape happen in a nanosecond by industry, by neglect or benign or intention. And if you perceive that, you really can get it quickly. What's going on so fast? It's very evident in those photos. If you take it to that step, the beauty is equal, but the temporality is, magnified by
Back to the time questions that's been pervading this, and I think in terms of even that first question about the planet is incredibly resilient and will be incredibly resilient at the scale of geological time. That in a way, we're not going to destroy the planet. We might destroy ourselves and our ability to inhabit it, but look at the next billion years of the planet, it's going to do something else. It's not going to stay put. And so this question of how do we actually transfer a knowledge about the potential resilience in geological time of the planet into a potential way of behaving that provides resilience in human time is actually a really interesting and again provocative way of thinking. And I think it does reflect the kind of optimism that making a photograph, creating a new transforming the landscape, acting in the world it imagines, is that one can act in ways that learn from that capacity for resilience. And that requires perhaps a different way of working than the one that we've been doing up in, for at least the last 150 years, which gets us away from this capacity to fix, or this desire to fix, to control, to make static the world around us, and eliminate that capacity for resilience, which is fundamentally one of the ways that we've been behaving as a culture. So there's real opportunity.
One of the things that struck me, maybe it's from sitting in this dome, but there was such a dialectic going on built into the process. There's this like Ansel Adams, I'm sorry, fake reality, or certainly for someone living in the lifetime I've lived, now fake reality. And this devastation picture on the other hand, and really just makes you want to cry, like that Indian who was also not even Indian. We know that he was Italian. And, but Terry actually, and all this stuff is presented as synthesis that I found really interesting. Every picture, I believe every picture we saw was a made landscape. And in fact, I was a gardener at the regional park, so they're all moderated. And there, in the presentation, there was one moment when you talked about that tulip had to have been planted. It wasn't just there. How much do you think about the human influence within the environment and what kind of world that we're making, and sometimes a positive way?
I think about it a lot, and I'm actually personally more comfortable when the human influence is there. Though I love the wilderness and I'm backpacking and such, for me it's something to look at and to respect and experience in a nominal way. One thing that I spent quite a bit of time this summer in Europe, and actually in France, which doesn't have a lot of wilderness, and it is a lot more static and a lot more set than what the U.S. is doing. And there was actually a comfortableness there. There was something that I noticed that I have no clue if anybody can shed some light on, and that is that the wildlife was much more sparse and less diverse from what I could see than even in my own backyard here in Washington. So, I want to get back to about the human and this question of class, and this larger question that again I often ask my students is who owns the land that we're talking about, and who is making the decisions about that land, and actually then I find that the grandson may be spending, and I find as a designer, I feel like I'm spending more time trying to change the mind, and influence the actions of the folks who own that land and who are making those decisions. And making those decisions, for instance, about where to locate their industry where there's the least resistance, and it's usually a community that doesn't have a strong political voice. So it's like they are downwind, they are downstream. So, I just, that's one of the first things, right, Roger, he talked about. It's just like, wait a second, this is not anonymous. Who owns that land? And it gets out of the individual. That actually, as individuals, we have to, influence that collective person that owns that land. And that's why I appreciate you brought up, the company, right? Because you're like, they own that land. So that's why that landscape looks that way.
Yes to that is the American public land is still under, assault daily, drill, baby, drill, etc. More and more applications for oil and gas leases on public land right now than before. And it's a reminder the American owns the public land, that it is something collectively we need to take responsibility for, and people have kind of moved away from that in the last decade about the concern for our public land.
There's also an insidious method used, for instance, with fracking, where they go into an area and it's an economic decision for people who sell their rights because the company says we can find valuable gas on your property, so people give it up. People, the actual in small plots, and they amass it together, which is another issue, which is controversial.
I wanted to say something that addresses teaching at the Corcoran since 2004, and I've been watching students that primarily educated in art leave with huge loans, and so economically not capable of kind of living in their own space and on their own, forming collectives and communes and group places to live, thinking about energy, getting together, putting solar panels on the roof, and bringing things to this kind of general communal and local level. And I just thought that could be interesting.
I think we have been playing with the concept and not facing it. That is the social responsibility, our social consciousness. And all of you have a high level of social consciousness, and you have contributed with what you love. So what we really have to develop in the kids is social consciousness and social responsibility marriage, and they can do whatever they love to do because everything will be towards social construction. I think that we have been playing with that. That's the answer to the young man. Because he has to find his own niche.
That may be a wonderful point.
Yeah.
We do need to conclude, and we do want to invite people to come down to OpenGrounds to continue the conversation individually and over lunch, just down the hill at the corner here. So I'd like to invite people to come down, and thank you for that note of optimism as a concluding comment. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and I particularly want to